So welcome everyone to the Cyber Security for the Olympics and other large-scale events. My name is Phil Morris. I'm the CTO for BT Japan. I'm going to be the moderator. I'd like to introduce our panelists. So first we have Mr. Mark Hughes. He's the CEO of BT Security and was responsible for end-to-end security for the London Olympics, so great experience to come to the table. He's also on the Senior Strategy Board for the CPNI in the UK, and he works a lot with the government sector, with the private sector, to get agreement on where things should go and how it should be handled. Next we have Mr. Takei, who is out of Intel, senior fellow at Intel that is very focused on cybersecurity and everything dealing with how do you make Japan a safer place from the Intel's perspective. Next, Mr. Ingram, who comes to us from Australia, and is a senior partner and director of cybersecurity for Australia, and with a big focus on fraud and risk analysis, and actually ran the fraud and risk analysis program for the Olympics in Sydney in 2000. And then we have Mr. Posh, who is the CIO for Austria, and also a full professor at Graz University. And he brings a plethora of experience across policy domains and security domains, teaching and actually practicing both sides of the fence. So bringing in academic plus real-life experience to really show what we can do. To that effect, I think what this panel is going to do is a little bit different than the last one. If you were in here before, we're not going to have a formal speaker. Instead, I'm going to have each panelist give about a 5 to 6 minute talk about their thoughts and ideas of how this is going to play out. And then I have a number of questions that we'll drill down into, and finally we'll open it up to the audience questions. So Mark, go ahead and lead us off.
Philip, thank you very much indeed. Well, as Philip said, I had the dubious honour of looking after all the security at the London Olympics. Before I do that, we in British Telecommunications do a lot of big events. And we recently, or we rather not that long ago, looked after the big NATO conference in South Wales, which obviously had its own characteristics around high security, the G7, as well as the Rugby World Cup. Some of you who have seen that. Any South Africans in the room? I hope not. So Japan did very well there, so we just looked after the security there as well. So yeah, so Rugby World Cup as well. But clearly one of the things that I wanted to spend my 5 minutes talking about, which I thought might be of interest to you all, is around the London 2012 Olympics. Did anyone watch any of the London 2012 Olympics? Yeah, I did. Yeah, you and 4.6 billion other people did that. Did anyone happen to watch the tennis final, the gold medal tennis event? Yeah, I didn't remember that. Andy Murray won it, playing Brits in the room, which is astonishing. And at that time, during that one event, to give you some idea of what was going on, 1.25 million unique visits to the website. Now bear in mind, 2012 was in a context where the iPad had only just been, or even not really, had hit the streets when Beijing 2008 appeared. More tweets were sent in 10 minutes during the London 2012 Games than in the entire Beijing 2008 Games. So to give you some idea, things had shifted remarkably between 2008 and 2012, and indeed from Vancouver 2010. And I'm sure the same thing will happen again, obviously, by the time 2020 comes around for Tokyo. A few things, though, that we often fail to know, and only because I happen to be quite involved in it, a few facts that I thought we pointed about London 2012, which are common to many games and big sporting events. The centrepiece of the Games is obviously the Olympic Stadium. There were, in fact, 94 sites in total in the London Games, which were in London, which are scattered around the UK. And the way in which the games were delivered was quite uniquely different from those of you in the room who are technologists, from a technology perspective. So there's some pretty important firsts. The one big first, especially for as far as we were concerned, is the lead sponsor for all network business. The important thing was it was a completely converged voice and data network, and also we converged the broadcast network onto the same single network as well. So that, in terms of security, presented some unique and interesting opportunities, let me call it that, and indeed challenges. But more specifically, and again, to cut to the chase about actually what goes on there, Essentially, the games works like this. There are three separate networks. There's a network that runs the London, the operating committee, sort of like an enterprise, if you want, it's an enterprise network. There's then a network that runs all of the traffic related to scoring and games time information. Obviously, that's very, very critical. But that, obviously, by its nature, has to be very publicly available, and there's lots of touch points there for the public. And then there is a network that is there for the press pack, the 30,000 journalists who appeared during the Games, the Paralympic Games in 2012. So subtly, those things are quite different. And finally, of course, there's the broadcast network. And all of those networks require a different level of treatment. So the scale of that was big. So convergence was big. The second point is that the application provider in the operating committee, Atos, had taken the opportunity between Beijing and London to rewrite a lot of the applications. So there were some new applications that hadn't been run for life. They'd gone through huge testing, honestly, but hadn't been run for life. So some interesting facts about London 2012. The second thing, which is just a point about 2012, is that when I started on the journey, we actually won our bid in 2006, 2007. When we started putting the design together, of course, we immediately started thinking about, well, who wants to do over the Olympic Games? We all love sport. A lot of people do. We all think the Olympics is a wonderful big event that everyone joins in at, and it's sort of, world hunger in the morning and world peace in the afternoon, as long as a few people can win the right medals and all that sort of stuff. Well, that's just simply not the case. There are so many different adversaries and people who want to have a go at the Olympics, which I was genuinely quite surprised about. You might say that sounds rather naive, but genuinely, there are more than you could possibly imagine. Everyone seems to have, who's got some cause, they have a problem, maybe in some shape or form with the Olympics, and therefore, suffice to say, it's a huge challenge. The third thing is about risk. And characteristically around risk, we often talk about risk in the generic form. Specifically, importantly, there are really two things. And the one that probably is most important when it comes to the Olympics is that it actually works. So that the 100-meter final actually appears on the TV and there isn't any drama with it and it actually happens. So in terms of mapping risks, the risk effort was really focused on availability and making sure that everything worked. And that's important, because that then led to a whole host of decisions that we had to make thereafter. In some cases, I was often banging the table to say, look, there's a vast amount of precious information, whether it's ticketing, whether it's stuff that's put up in terms of integrity of information on the scoring system, stuff that we have to be really mindful of and put controls around. But that was always playing second place to the availability challenge. So a few things. Therefore, it won't be surprising for you to hear that we had to take a very different approach for our security. All the normal security controls that we put in place, really, they were important and had to be laid in, but the reality is we had to think about something really quite different. And we came up with an approach which basically sampled vast amounts of data, vast amounts of network traffic in real time, and we started looking for weak signals that would give us some indication of compromise, which we could then act on. Now, back then in 2012, it was relatively new. Fast forward to today, that forms the basis now of how we protect our entire business, and a lot of other businesses around the world as well. So really quite different in terms of its thinking. So, I'm sure you're all keen to know what actually happened. For those of you, the number of you in this room, out of the 4.6 billion, well, stuff did happen. Quite a lot happened, in fact. There was at least one big hacktivism type attack a day. DDoS was really, I see that the 2012 was the resurgence of DDoS. And we all now know a lot more about it. Back then, it was almost like, well, we've dealt with that. No, we saw some much more sophisticated attacks. And indeed, APTs, which were sort of a twinkle in some people's eyes at that point, really, it was from that we saw a lot of stuff happening in the 2012 environment, which has now been industrialized over in intervening years. But to give you some scale, 11,000 malicious requests per second on London2012.com. Over 200 million malicious events were detected, which, just this huge scale of false positives in that created some real challenges. And back to what I was saying earlier on, how we honed that down into stuff which we then actually had to focus on was the huge challenge which we achieved on Super Saturday, which is the Saturday in the middle of the games. For those of you involved in 2020, you'll get to know these things very well. 128 million malicious events alone on the services that we're providing. So, Philip, if I may, just for a couple of things, a few things that I just want to pick up on. So a few themes from London 2012, which I see recurring, and funny enough, not much of them are about security. The first theme that I want to talk to is about risk assessment. So the thing that we had to get our head around very quickly, and not us on our own, was how we worked out the overall approach that we were going to take to risk, not just for the 2012 games, but very importantly for the almost the risk that existed in the UK beyond the games. And in some cases, when we were looking at the risk, that almost was a bigger risk. The general threat environment that the UK became, ingesting millions of visitors, lots of very, very heads of state, and obviously the target that it was in its own right. That risk, that consequential risk, was something which played a huge part. And as a Tier 1 global carrier, we're obviously involved in providing all those services to our customers day in, day out. That also was a pretty big priority for us. We couldn't allow our games time activity to distract us from delivering critical services to our national infrastructure in the UK and beyond, right around the world. So understanding those various risk elements, who was doing the risk assessments, pretty important to how government and other bits work together, the organising committee, and also then being able to work out where the aggregated risk was, and then being able to do something about it and control it, not just from a technical point of view, but also from a physical point of view. Very important. We locked down lots of manhole covers, lots of very tight control around equipment rooms and the like. That was essential to get right. Just one other small fact about the consequential risk. We had to triple our bandwidth provision in our core networks to deal with people watching real-time media streaming. For it to give you some idea, we saw a lot of people working from home and watching it. Well, maybe they should be working, but that's not for me to say. Anyhow, the second theme, governance. Governance is really important. A rather dry subject, but one if we haven't got that right, and it wasn't right to start with. We had to think really hard about it. And I don't just mean about us as a network provider, how all the various parts of government, the ODA, the Operating Games Committee, local in London's case, the Technical Operations Centre, which actually ran the technical operations, all of those things worked together, understanding what role each other played. And in some cases, incidents that we were involved in had nothing to do with the games, but needed national level attention. So working out all of those with law enforcement, big challenge, and has to be got right. And the only way to get it right is to work it and rehearse it, which brings me on to my next theme, which is about rehearsal. And we rehearsed for 3 years, and there's a very dedicated timeline for how you rehearse as you go. But frankly, we did a lot of adjustment to ensure that we got to a point where we were slick at what we were doing, where simply everyone was almost doing things by rote, as opposed to having to think about it at the time. The technical lockdown, my next theme is one about change and how you cope with change. So the ideal scenario in, I'm sure, 2020 as it comes is, let's get to a point, even now, certainly was the case in London, where the initial designs of the infrastructure were locked down. Well, clearly, if you're looking out from where we are now in 2015 to 2020, a lot's going to change in our cybersecurity world. There has to be flexibility. There's a reluctance, as you can imagine, from the organising committee to have new and shiny technologies introduced. In our world of cyber, there's a new product that appears, every 5 minutes. How do you create an infrastructure and a security environment that allows you to plug in new pieces? We have to think that very hard to get it right for 2012 and have the ability to put stuff in a drop of a hat. The next theme is about infrastructure. I've mentioned it before, physical, but people as well. A lot of people involved, obviously, in organising the games. There's a characteristic of the organising committees that they virtually they have no staff for a long period, and then have very few staff. Come nearer the games, suddenly there's a huge ramp up, and then equally a massive shedding of all the staff, obviously, once the games and Paralympic games have gone. So understanding who those people are and what they do, what levels of access they have, for people who might only appear for 3 or 4 weeks at a time, it's a big challenge, and we have to think about that hard. Next is about critical assets. Understanding what the critical assets are that actually support the games themselves, and then working out where you put your effort onto. The next point is about focus, which comes from that, so focusing on those assets. So for example, when looking at a website, and thinking about how websites are constructed, building a layer of defense, but focusing specifically on where user-defined input can be, where it actually exists, and therefore really focusing on how you secure those elements of it. And finally, I think what it represented for the UK and for us as a business is a massive opportunity. And I don't mean it in terms of, wasn't it great that we were a proud sponsor of the 2012 Games. I mean an opportunity that we completely changed our game in cybersecurity because of the Olympic Games. And not only that, it created a platform in the UK to open the doors for a comprehensive cybersecurity strategy, which is now many years old and is going through the next iteration. So a huge opportunity for the UK to make the UK basically a safer place to repel cyber criminals and the like. That's it.
Great, thank you, Mark. Jim?
Thank you very much. Hi. Let me finish impact. So my name is Jun Takei. I'm working at Intel Corporation. I'm located in Portland, Oregon now, but usually I was working in Tokyo, and I was responsible for all the policy-related model in Indo-Japan business and also Asian region. At that time, when I was in Tokyo, I told in University with Professor Rai about the technology and policy relationship, so cybersecurity and how to educate the society or how to let the society people know the importance of cybersecurity. That is one of the challenge in the lecture. So as many of you know, Intel, we are providing building block for the IT infrastructure that start from the computer chip, processor, and also we provide software and services. So we provide a lot of product in the society, and we do business around the world. So we are not focusing on one region or one country, but we see all the nation, all the country around the world. So my team is called Global Public Policy Team. We are collaborating with all the government, key government, who are interested in work with implement IT technology for the growth of the country. So those countries or government are interested in what is the right measure or what is the right recommendation for the growth of our country. And sometimes they are concerned about how to protect the nation. But in the cybersecurity discussion, we hear a lot of concern about how to protect the nation. And also, they said we don't want to compromise the capability of ICT. So balancing that cybersecurity protection and also the benefit of ICT, that is a great challenge for us. And there is no clear answer, but what I can tell and what I can ideally want to share with all the audience and all the speakers is we should always remember that ICT infrastructure provide all the activity for the people around the world. So if we find some issues and then some group try to implement some countermeasure or reaction or regulation, sometimes that may harm the future benefit of the ICT infrastructure. So ICT, as an ICT industry, we have a dialogue with the government if they have plan or if they discuss the regulation or rule making. We, as a technology company, provide the government latest information or the future roadmap. What kind of technology will come? What kind of technology we can use at this moment? That kind of dialogue we are having as a company and group. So that is my role in the United States, and especially my group is responsible for cybersecurity, privacy, and now internet-related discussion. So let me pick one key topic. What we see big challenge for the company or for the society is that how to level up, how to bring the bottom or the foundation of the cybersecurity protection of all the people or all the company, including the government company, all the stakeholders. That is a challenge. And now, as you can see, the first session this morning, everybody understands what they have to do, but they don't know how to do that. That is a challenge we see. And so, as an industry point of view, the law, and the ball is held by the government or stakeholders. But the challenge is small, medium business or consumers. We believe, as in the technology industry, we believe we still have a ball, important ball. That means we still have a key responsibility how to help them, how to provide a safer environment, how technology can help them. But frankly speaking, I have to say the technology is still complex, and our product is very complex and a lot of variety of the options that makes difficult end user to choose the best combination. So that is a challenge as an industry. So maybe what we need to do as an industry and government, collaborating with the government, would be how to set up the good communication channel, getting support from the government or collaborating with the government. So actually, I discussed this prayer just before this session. Many people use broad regulation, but I think in cybersecurity, we should not use the regulation. Regulation, that is a rule or law, and sometimes it could be said that can remain more than 24 months. But in IT, 24 months old regulation or recommendation, that is too old. So I think in a company, we usually tend to use the recommendation. Recommendation can be updated, let's say, every 6 months, every 12 months. Then communicate with the end user or the society. That is the thing we need to do, seeing from the industry point of view. So I think in this session, this is focusing on Olympics, preparing for Pyongyang. I'm sorry, I can't get to pronounce it. Toward 2020, what we can do, that I think we should not focus on how to deliver the Olympics successful. That is one of the objectives, that how to bring the society up to the reliable and better and good society that can carry on the growth of the economy and get great something good for the people. That is the goal. As we to participate in this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Steve, you want to give us your perspective?
Sure, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having the time with us today. I guess my key message is that if we haven't started already, start now. In fact, start yesterday. I think there's three, maybe there's a fourth. There's much better. Again, good afternoon. If you haven't started yet, start now, start yesterday. What we need to understand is who are we dealing with, who's attacking us? What is it they want? Why do they want to attack us? And then importantly, it came out through Mark's dialogue, who are we working with, what are we working with, how are we dealing with it? And then there's probably a fourth point I'll add on after your comments just then, and that is to not wait for the government to do this. I think the way the world has changed has brought new responsibilities and accountabilities. Now, our adversaries don't wait on a centralised authority to tell them what to do. They're very dynamic, they're very agile. And if we wait for government to take the lead in this, I think we're just falling further behind. So who are we dealing with? I used to have an expression I called OSHI, and I talked to a lot of senior executives to make them more aware of cyber. And OSHI it sounds pretty cool, right? Yeah? Some more anticipation? Yes, thank you. That sounds cool. It's like a Japanese lunch sandwich. So it stands for organised crime, state-sponsored, activists, and insiders. There's a fifth one now that we need to add, which is T for terrorists. But I can't put that at the end of Washington. So let's call it voice. And it's important to understand these groups because they each have a different motive. The hacktivists are probably one of the more difficult. They're just often difficult to understand. They'll have motives that are even off your core business. They might want to disrupt the Olympics for nothing to do with the Olympics, but it is such a global draw card, it's a great way for them to get attention. So they're hard to predict. State-sponsored? Well, there are geopolitical issues here. There's geopolitical issues within a couple of hundred miles of where we sit right now. So that's a very serious challenge that we need to think about and the government needs to deal with. Organised crime. I saw this in the Olympics. I was at an anti-corruption commission when I was with the federal police prior to the Olympics. And we saw organised crime moving in early. I think we were fortunate that we had a commissioner of the anti-corruption body I worked for that had vision. And 5 years out from the Olympics determined that we needed a task force so that when the Olympics came, there was no integrity issues. We're a pretty small nation. It's not uncommon that people you might invite to an advisory panel for the Olympics might also be the CEO of a company that's going to be a provider for the Olympics. So we wanted to make sure that any issues were identified early, any potential for corruption or conflicts of interest. We set up hotlines because even with, and I was reading about the radicalisation of terror, kids in terror, right? And the latest thinking is that someone near that kid knows that they're going to be radicalised or that they've changed their behaviour. Man, I've been investigating fraud and cybercrime and security since the mid-80s, and I've never seen an incident where someone near the person that did it wasn't aware. There's always someone that knows, someone that has suspicions. If they don't have the mechanism to raise that, it gets lost. And we find out after the event and it's too late. So we need to understand the organised crime groups, right? They want to get money, they want to steal credentials, they want to sell fake tickets, they want to steal IP. They're active and they're always there. We've got the insider. Very difficult. The biggest risk, the PwC Global State of Information Security Survey, again, year after year finds the greatest risk that the 10,000 respondents report is insiders. They know the keys to the kingdom, they know the way around the kingdom. They're very difficult to deal with if they're disgruntled, unhappy, or if they're compromised by organised crime, state-sponsored, activist or terrorist group, they've got someone on the inside. And the terrorists are just looking for carnage. They just want disruption, they just want to disrupt the way of life. They want to draw attention much like the activists. So what we need to look at as we plan for the Olympics is taking each of those 5 threat actor groups, understanding what each of them wants, and then how does that impact on us? We've got to think about this as well as not as a person wearing a suit and glasses that lives in a business environment and travels a lot, right? We've got to think about this in the mind of those actors. How many people thought what would happen if someone flew an aeroplane into a skyscraper, right? People have thought about that for a long, long time. September 11 actually did it. We've got to think like these people if we're going to really protect the integrity of the games. We've got to think beyond what we might think is comfortable or palatable and really embrace their drivers. They're not ours. We don't think like them. We don't live like them. We need to understand what's driving them so we can put systems in place. And then you come to my third point, and this to me is cybersecurity is not about technology. Hands up if you've been to the RSA conference in San Francisco at any time. How many thousands of software vendors are there? How many thousands of software vendors that were there in April this year are still going to be there in February next year? If we bought a tenth of all the software solutions they provide, Mark, how would you integrate that and get everything to work and not just bring your systems down from some other activity? But the weakest link, I think, is the people, and again, you touched on it in your discussion. We've all got fire brigades, police departments, we've got intelligence departments, you've got critical infrastructure, you've got banks, you've got government agencies, it's endless. And everyone within those has the best intention, but they normally want to work as a team within their group, and they don't always know the team across the hall. The problem is, if you have an attack, you have an incident, it's too late to find out who Reinhardt is. It's too late. I've got to know that before. When we helped recently with the G20 in Australia, we ran a 2-week war, basically. We attacked the numerous government departments and critical infrastructure agencies, private sector. We attacked them for 2 weeks with denial of service, with phishing, with spam, with ransomware. We made physical attacks. We photographed staff. We created false ID. We gained access to buildings. We deployed poison games. We did a whole lot of things, but it was so important for that 2 weeks. All of the various departments got to know who Reinhardt was. They could work with that person. There was a familiarity, there was an esprit de corps, there was a common purpose, there was fast communications. And you listen to the plenary session this morning, sharing information is critical. That makes a difference. I think the Olympics, I think G20 were a good place to be because information was shared quickly, intelligence was shared quickly, and when things went wrong, and things do go wrong, we responded quickly, and that was because we practiced. So practice, practice, practice. I think then, coming back to that fourth point that I added, ownership. You know, Japan's got some great things, and I was just looking at this earlier today. Japan's got the Cybersecurity Strategic Headquarters, that's got representatives from a whole lot of different government departments and agencies. They've got the NISC, and they've got great policies, they've got great legislation. The challenge to me is, does that become compliance? Is it to have something in place and anything gets done? So my question there would be, how does that work end to end? Where has the testing been done to make sure all of those agencies work together? They've got great global engagement. If you look at this room, right, the C3 is terrific, and you know, PwC are heavily involved in this. I'm constantly asked by my colleagues in Japan, you know, we've often been seen as an accounting firm. Well, hopefully from what I've just talked about with all the testing and things that we've done, you can see we're not. But I'm often asked by my colleagues for information on what's happening overseas because they want to bring it back to the government agencies here and share those learnings with them. So there's a great appetite to learn. And the police, they've got a cybercrime team in each prefecture. I think they're probably pretty well connected. But is it a two-way connection? Do the police just take information or do they share it? It's the discussion this morning. If the regulator becomes your central point of information sharing, one, I think, you know, most of my clients wouldn't trust that channel. And two, does the intent of that collection point change and become more of a regulator? So I think private sector needs to step up, needs to get something happening themselves and invite government as a participant. And leaning towards the Olympics, I think it's a great time to do that. We heard from Mark, the UK benefited, the economy benefited from what we learned there, and I think Japan and Korea are in a great place to do the same thing. So that's my aim.
Thank you, Steve. And Reinhardt.
Thank you. As a CEO of a country, I'm responsible for strategy, basically, and I was delighted that our colleague from BT put governance as the first item. I think this is really what it is about. It's about understanding in the first place. Like with Olympics, you're bringing together various cultures. How do you understand these cultures? How do you get a big picture of that? Just to give you one example, we have the European Football Championship, and there you have lots of problems with hooligans and these types of things in the physical world. And what we did was a very simple action. We brought in policemen from Poland and from Germany in their uniform, because you have to think on a human way. Troublemakers will behave differently if they think they are at home, they feel like at home. And indeed it worked. It worked in a tremendous way. And it was a very simple action. They were not there to act as police forces to support them, but just to be physically and visibly there. And why I'm putting that in front? When you work together with other nations on this global event, like your certs, etc., it might be an idea to integrate in terms of building trust, etc. People from other certs physically in your environment to speed up communication, to speed up trust. Another point is we have to watch single point of failures. which is increasingly complicated. Just think about the fact that we have a tremendous overcapacity of switching, which means that switching is going around the globe just for monetary reasons. And we have one experience where one switch for landlines went down, and it teared down the mobile networks immediately, because things are optimized. They're optimized for a specific situation, and if the situation is going out of balance, all the other systems will also. So you have to be very careful on these single point of failures, and most probably as well exercise and make assumptions on that one. And as I tried to point out, it's about the interaction between the physical and the cyber layer. And we experienced that these people, we have in place a long-standing group for crisis management in the physical area. They just do not understand cyber, and vice versa. It's a big task, and you have to go there early on to bring these minds together, because they have totally different attitudes, and that is feasible if you plan it. Another point is, and we've heard that in this morning to some extent, that mixed jurisdictions are an obstacle, are a big obstacle to get a big picture on cybersecurity situations. Mixed jurisdiction is a competitive advantage for the criminals, to put it that way, and large events open up a variety of questions with that regard, because you have fast moving and fast growing identities, and how do you introduce, how do you trust, etc., etc. So one aspect would be to limit, or to at least to get some of this by including identity scheme of nationals of nations into the event identity scheme. So to not to duplicate, or as you said in London, you took the badges for the event as a visa to get through either the customs or through the border control. International communication. We as of now, we do not know where it really comes from. We do not know where it has traveled through. And perhaps I do not fully agree with what has said this morning. We said this morning that we cannot approach this. We might be able to approach to give the user the right to know where the communication came from, where the communication has traveled through. And just think, when you go home, think about this, what that would mean in terms of e-banking, etc., etc. And that's a long-term aspect, but we have to think about that. It would limit the sheer gathering of information for later use, etc., etc. And another point with that regard, with the mixed jurisdiction and with the legal aspects, is roaming and device reconfiguration. We have very weak identification of service providers in the mobile sector, which means that we just have to wait until on a large scale a roaming fraud will be there to intervene with your devices. Now, who is safeguarding privacy? Who is safeguarding identity, authenticity, integrity, cross jurisdiction? That's a big issue. All these are not equally treated in different jurisdictions, and that will impact liabilities. Very soon you end up in a situation where you cannot track down liabilities. That's and that comes further on ticket sailing, etc., etc. So if something happened, you are sort of stuck unless you solve that. Perhaps we have to work on the societal aspects a little bit, because that might be a big advantage. If we have a pattern how we work in the normal situation, we will use that pattern in an extreme situation. That's what military does all the time. And therefore, exercise, build that pattern so that you can use it in an emergency situation, because any other pattern will be worse. The ad hoc solution usually makes a problem, as we know. We will have, and it's just a question of when we'll have IT-guided attacks and on key-assisted attacks on weakness, what have you. And there's also one aspect Luxembourg has worked into, is the disruption of infrastructures in near catastrophic situations. Like you have an accident in a tunnel and you don't have a possibility to get communication out of that tunnel. There is technological ways we might think about, which is autonomous networks which go like Bluetooth or wireless line from mobile phone to mobile phone, just to have a small channel to give one signal. There is a hotspot. But that's also something we have to work on. Now, it is changing. It is changing, as has been mentioned. One aspect is authorities increasingly are using, due to budgetary reasons, just standard systems, standard approaches, which means they are drawn to standard attacks. And they, in many ways, don't think about that. Autonomous systems are becoming reality, and that has a totally different way of thinking about attack detection and detection of criminal activities. Because the criminal is most probably not putting himself under in a visible way. The question in total is the pace of increasing complexity equal to the pace of defending our systems? Which one is growing faster? That is the basic question. Are we losing while we're gaining? If you look on like the attack on the Jeep, which was theoretically, but that is going to happen sooner or later.
Thank you so much for your answer. So this was a really good discussion around a lot of the topics and some real-world experiences both for Sydney and for London. A couple of topics came up in multiple aspects, right? One of them was how do you do that initial risk assessment and impact assessment and the 5 actors that you have to go through. So obviously there's going to be a different situation for each type of large event. So an Olympics is going to have a different whole host of actors and why they're acting than, say, a G7 summit or a Davos in Switzerland. Or even if Alison had personally made it here, the attack profile changes just because of the guests who are there. So is there a standardized policy for how you go through and do this? And as we were discussing this morning, we have Chertop's discussion, how do you actually put some value to that risk and then know how to protect against it?
Well, I'm a firm believer that if you can take a number on pretty well most of the risk. London 2012, cast our minds back again, it's about today. There was a company called G4S, Group for Security Corp. Maybe some of you may have heard about them. Stock price still remains 17.86% down from where it was on the fateful day that they couldn't manage the guarding arrangements for 2012 games. I think that's valid. Pretty straightforward. So, of course, the challenge is, that sounds like a great headline, but how do you turn it into something actually real? I think there were some encouraging noises. So Michael Chertoff talked this morning about the fact that if an insurance market exists, therefore there must be a way of pricing that insurance. That is maturing. And we are seeing, therefore, more ability to be able to put a price on risk. It's fairly straightforward, I see, but impact likelihood, curve on it, risk frontier curve, work it out, look at the scenarios, look at the black swans, and then one will come up with a price or a series of prices, and then you can then work out what your proportionate control strategy should be. Of course, if you think about the X and Y axis of an impact and likelihood graph, I always think of that sort of Z axis that appears out of the heat from a piece of paper, which is the reputational risk. Of course, I've had again, for every time that someone told me that, reputational risk, how do you price it, I'd be pretty wealthy. And the reason why I say that is because I don't bother. Because there is it's almost too hard to do, and what I say is reputationally, use a bit of common sense. So go through detailed impact and likelihood assessments, look at them where you end up, and just put a common sense test on it. We're in the business of shipping vast amounts of traffic around the world, around global networks. There are things that we have to do, we know that we just have to do. And so, but having said that, the basis of assessing risk is that you end up in a situation where I think you have to be able to price. And that's pretty fundamental, pretty important. I would add one thing though, about risk, which I spoke a bit about earlier on. This is something that came strongly through in 2012 and continues as a theme in cybersecurity regardless. And some of the concepts around this were spoken about this morning. Air traffic control, the cyber disaster, the planes falling out of the sky, the never event, the black swan events, all these things that we talk about a lot. Now, what that often comes down to, I think, is that if you disaggregate those risks, it actually is relatively straightforward to work out what you have to do to control them. But the thing that I always think gets in the way is no one quite understands whose risk is whose. And to me, that is something that, it isn't easy. The only way you're going to deal with that is by getting busy and working out that we generally think at a national level there is a series of risks. How do you disaggregate those to then do the right bits in there? But importantly, with that disaggregation comes ownership, so that one is clear at what level you're managing risks at. It's a big challenge, and then how you price that up that follows, the price follows once you've worked out whose risk is whose. So a few thoughts on this.
Thank you. Right.
Just a small comment. I think it's very important what you pointed out in a small sentence. We have to find commonalities with existing things. We have to carefully sort out the feasible and not target at the things which are just new. Because the first time we might make it wrong. And that is very important on the risk assessment. You mentioned 9/11. It was not in our mind that this will happen. We will never have that assumed as to be a risk at that point in time. And then we made things about that. We have closed doors when you go to the pilot's cabin. So far, I'm going to risk assessment. So far, the only known result of that was the German wings. So risk assessment is a very complicated thing, and you have to be very careful in sorting out the things.
Excellent points, and we're all very organised and ordered and methodical, and so we'll do a risk assessment on 9/11. And whilst no one thought it would happen, I'm sure thousands of people thought it could happen. And instead of being ordered and organised, I wonder if we could challenge ourselves and think, what's the last thing we want to happen? What's the worst thing we want to happen? And work backwards from there. Even think about the unimaginable, and if we try to build that in. You talked about single points Australia. I call them white space, right? And one element of white space could cause catastrophic disaster. It's more probable that 4 or 5 together will, and that's 3 issues to make an aircraft crash. So we need to identify those things. But then when we get to that point of understanding them, start again, because that's an unintended consequence, German wings, but that's a disastrous outcome of a policy resulting from 9/11.
I think risk assessment, that is very important factor, and there's a variety of risk assessment. And one of the things we, as Intel, we always think about, encourage end user to deal with risk assessment is how much value your data values in the market. Maybe that is the usual market or black market. That kind of risk assessment is very important, but usually that is not done by usual enterprise or end user consumers. Consumers customer may store very important privacy-related information in PC or smart home, smart mobile devices that they don't care about how to protect the data inside the device. Sometimes they may encrypt, or sometimes they put that data on the cloud with encryption. So there's a lot of technology that can protect the information and value, but unfortunately that is not well communicated to the end user or enterprise and end-to-end level. So that, in that sense, I really agree with the risk assessment point of view to deliver the great Olympic and also great infrastructure there.
And taking it one step up, there was a lot of discussion around governance. And the complexity, especially for something as large as the Olympics, is that typically you have a physical security aspect to it, you have the operational runtime cybersecurity aspect to it, but in crossing over into another track, you have the crime aspects, and you have the multi-police forces type of situation. And in fact, a good example of that is if you have these multi-party capabilities and you're being attacked from somewhere, as part of the governance structure, should you be looking at bringing in resources from potential attacking countries that then you could use those police agencies to immediately go to their ISPs and allocate the records or get something turned off or turned down as quickly as possible. Because as was mentioned, the government can either facilitate things or they can get in the way, right? And what is the right governance structure to make it facilitating as opposed to delaying?
So that's like engaging. And so this whole internet, we're in a whole new world, a whole new ecosystem. And as a business, our customers are part of our business, our suppliers are part of our business, our regulators are part of our business. And we're just coming to terms with that. But I really like the concept that you're putting out there. We're defensive. So as a business, a bank in Australia is typically defensive, and we're getting better cooperation between banks, but we need more. The financial services sector in Australia is a bit more defensive. And Australia is, and I suspect that if you're going to run games in a country in this region, you'll want to be very reliant on local resources and defensive of others. But what a great way to diffuse some situations if you actually invite them in, and it's great thinking out of the box.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think it comes back to the point you made earlier, Steve. Practice, practice, and practice, and make sure that comes and is part of the cycle. And here's the thing, and I found this in London, and just bear with me, and I apologise in advance if there are any Russians in the room. So we often talk about Russia in this part of the world, I'm sure, and in other places, and not necessarily, there's quite clear evidence that there's a lot of criminality that comes out of everywhere, but there's obviously lots of organised crime coming out of Russia. As there are in other places in the world, we often talk about Russia. Well, imagine this, there we are in London 2012, and you have this the Olympic culture that is that you have to embrace it. It's a big family, as I said earlier on, everyone's happy, but actually not quite, because everyone wants to try and do you over in some way. So there we are in London 2012, the Sochi delegation here. Is that the next games? Here you are, Mark. Here are all the Sochi delegation. The protocol now is that you open everything up. Show everything that's going on. Sharp intake of breath later. I said, oh, that's not quite culturally where we are. But, I mean, at the end of the day, Sochi had to put on, and did put on a fantastic Winter Games. And, the only way that we're going to collectively get better at this is that, as you rightly say, Reinhard, Steve, you work together and you come up with these, what are out-of-the-box ideas. That then opens the doors to saying, guess what, we're all in the same boat here, we've all got the same challenge. How do we actually deal with it? So culturally, my mindset certainly has changed quite a lot, and indeed continues to be, and it came through a lot of stuff that had to happen there.
Just a short addition. I think we know what we should do. We should work together on research, what happened in that basis. We should make exercises together, like CERTs of many countries. But as I mentioned, we have this cultural differences, and you just pointed out Sochi. But this, in reality, brings us to a situation that we have to experience on an atom how to exchange on a small scale in the first place. Otherwise it will not work. Because it's about trust, and I think trust is about humans. So that's why I would really be in favor of experimenting, bringing on board certain people into the hosting countries prior to the games, so that you have all the trust relationships that you can do that quick activities.
Let me share one interesting story. I think that this is similar thing, how to build trust. And so some of you know that China, Korea, Japan, we have a very unique relationship and unique history. But somehow we have a good relationship in terms of telecommunication operation. So operator level, CJK, China, Korea, Japan, we work together, and that is for the same thing can be said to the internet operation. So South, JP South and Korea, China South collaborate very closely, and all the three organizations knows what will happen in certain day. So certain day, international holiday or certain historical day, they understand what will happen. So they are prepared. They are prepared and ready to bring up the hotline. That telephone. I don't know if they have left the telephone or not, but they have a hotline, and they can reduce the incident or they can stop the incident very quick. That is the, I think, one of the examples we can build trust, utilizing the operation level over a year.
So I think the point goes across all of the aspects, right? So if you get into cybercrime and you have a ticket fraud campaign that's happening both on the cyber and physical side, you know, the search can really need to work together, but you still have the physical side problem, right, of the team in place. So these kind of things, I think we need to think on a broader scale, because the challenges are becoming a merger between the physical and the cyberspace now. Everything from building management systems inside the building being taken over to get into a point of sale system like Target, smart car technologies, where simply rolling down a window, taking over just enough to roll down a window could lead to a very bad political event. So,
Could I just come back to what you said? Well, on a regional basis, I fully understand what you're saying, and you could say the same thing about Europe to some extent. But the question now is, how do we get further? Because there's no regional border. Do we get further on a hierarchical basis? You know, we work together region to region. That contradicts our perception of trust. Trust is not hierarchical. Trust is bilateral. Or do we get on a different, and then on the Olympic Games you have so many partners, and that will be a barrier by itself. So that building of trust, that trust relationship you need there, we need a model.
So next question, Mark, you mentioned 4 distinct networks, the enterprise OCOG network, plus the press, the broadcast, and then the games line. But I would argue there's even a 5th network, and maybe more, the public network, especially the high-density Wi-Fi that BT deployed for the Olympic Park. And each of those have a different security profile, and a risk profile, and an impact profile. I would say probably the 2 most challenging of that are the press, because they have to have open, completely unfettered access, and of course the public Wi-Fi, because demand clouding and neural attacks, DNS attacks, et cetera, they can go on quite easily in that space. How do you approach that, or how do you suggest that China and Japan, Korea and Japan approach that?
Yeah, I mean, things move on. Wi-Fi was an interesting one. We had, we didn't build in a big Wi-Fi provision when the original tech was put in 2008. Of course, Wi-Fi exploded in the interim period. The good news is that a lot of our staff from BT got the first chance to see the Olympic Stadium out of anyone, because we then had to have enough people in the stadium to be able to test the mass provision of Wi-Fi, which actually now underpins all the Super Bowl games and all the rest of it. If you don't know those mass sporting events, how we deal with that as carriers now is we target certain elements of the audience at any one time with very high density Wi-Fi. It's something, a specific piece of technology that's developed for 2012 now, pretty well standard for big sporting events, quite interesting. So there we are, lots of happy staff, they got to see the stadium and they're all buzzing after it, and it worked, thank goodness. So just to give you an idea, that's one consideration there of how we dealt with that. Interestingly, in Wi-Fi itself, think about how regulation played a part there, about what the local rules are about how you deal with Wi-Fi and logins and resolving for law enforcement type purposes. That was an interesting challenge. But more broadly, how do we deal with different networks? Well, they're very, very different. Broadcast network, latency, availability, you can imagine, is right up there. There is nothing bigger than that when it comes to our world of networking. Journalist network, very different environment. So very open, completely the almost opposite end of the scale of the broadcast network. And of course, any journalist who appeared, all 30,000, for, I want to come in, shove it in, I paid the money, it should work. We put any old device on it. So it was sort of almost the biggest bring your own device challenge that you could imagine. No standard build, no nothing, and a lot of people are pretty prickly when you say, no, that's not going to happen. But there was a meeting of minds. It was almost a massive incident, massive critical incident, where I said, look, we are going to, when we see machines that are vulnerable, that have vulnerabilities running on them, that are unpatched or whatever it may be, and will represent a risk to everyone else who's using the service, we'll deal with them, we'll shut them out, we'll deal with them, we'll get them to remediate, and then we'll bring them back in. It's escalated up to the International Olympic Committee, the UK is doing this, that, and all the rest of it. I stuck my hand up and said, no, it's me, in BT. You've got to accept the fact that we cannot live in a world where we're going to fundamentally put potential games time networks at risk by this stuff going on. So once we got over that, and there was a mutual understanding that we found a way forward, and that was it. And again, I think in 2020, perceptions would have moved on. We haven't even mentioned Rio, that next year there'll be a lot of intervening time will elapse that people now begin to realise that actually this is a much more widespread issue than it was then. But journalists have a certain way of doing things which one has to be accommodated towards, but not at the expense of everyone.
On the fraud side?
Well, yeah, I mean, journalist accreditation is a fantastic tool for a criminal, activist, terrorist, because they normally got better access to more places. So there's something from the physical side of what we need to be conscious of. There's also, I think most of your reference there, Mark, was to within local and the games, but there's also getting to the games. So one of the things that we did for the G20 preparation was actually in the early hours of the morning, attempted to take and succeeded to take control of traffic light systems. So we found through OT and such. I mean, OT I think is a big issue for us coming up. When the games happen in 2020, there'll be technology that we didn't think of in 2014. But this technology that has been there for a long time, a game like 9/11, but people just thought it's okay. OT represents a big risk, and we've got some terrific teams that have been able to, within the time of this meeting, I have a team that once accessed public transport closed circuit television. Now, what you do with that's something else, but I mean, there's so many vulnerabilities there already that we're just not thinking about. If you can stop people getting to the games, it might be an easier target than actually getting someone in the game.
And that brings up go ahead, Brad.
Just a simple idea. We know that Wi-Fi is putting up some risk. We know that, for example, in 2017, Europe will get rid of roaming fees, which will change the Wi-Fi situation. Now, you could even think including the roaming fee into the ticket. That would give you lots of offloading of risk of Wi-Fi because you distribute the risk to the national operators.
So I think the last question I'm going to ask before we open it up to the audience participation, when you start taking a look at the multivariate types of basically cyber crime that can come into this situation, everything from accreditation fraud to malware on the reporters' systems that go out and infect other systems that could then potentially help solve, get into the scoring system and change people's scores. That was certainly scenarios that you have to be aware of when we were broadcasts going down, things like the timing scoring being changed, right? Or even worse, if somebody is on drugs and they hack into the drug testing company that does that and shows them as a clean result, and then they win their challenge, but they won it illegally, but they got a passive credit, right? So what is the key factor, not just for security, but against true cybercrime? And because most of the organizational aspects of what's going to attack these kind of large events outside of a G7 or NATO is much more aligned with the criminal than the cyber nation than the national actor.
Everyone's looking this way. It's such a big question. I mean, there's no end to the activities and the types of crime that can be committed. And you pointed out as well, maybe the Olympics are such a hard target, they go for the periphery, the drug testing or the traffic lights. I look at where we are, it's much like the way I think road safety has improved over the years. Now, when I was a kid in the 60s, we drove a car that had no power brakes, it was badly put together, there were no seatbelts, no airbags, speed limits were pretty much pretend. Engineering on roads was really poor. And today we've got airbags, there's radars that detect your speed, there's random breath testing, roadside drug testing, better brakes, better manufacturing, better awareness and education for drivers. And every time we do something though, there's something else that comes up, and the road toll in Australia is still unacceptable. It's like a tenth of what it was when I was a kid. When you look at, if you try and tie a few things together, people talk about what's the cost, what's the damage, what's at risk. We heard a bit about insurance as well. I often get chief risk officers, CEOs say to me, look, we spend all this money on new systems and we're getting more attacks. And I think, well, no, it's not wasted money. This is a bit like a radar, right? If you put a radar up on a piece of highway and you detect 120 people speeding, they were still there without the radar. You just didn't know. So I think, trying to answer your question is quite broad. You need to understand your crown jewels. You need to understand what those threat actors want from you, from your event, from your situation. You can't protect and investigate everything. But what are the critical elements you can try and control? How do you engage the stakeholders so that it's money well spent? And how do you continue that maturity? I guess it is a process of maturity.
And June, that goes right into your topic of up-leveling the entire society, and how do you get even reporters who really aren't technologists at all to have better protection by default?
Yes, so in the morning session, I heard this comment from somebody. This is not the technical problem. Cybersecurity issue is not technical problem anymore. It's human problem. How to bring the human capability, and how can we bring the level of the understanding and the reputation of the preparedness. That is a challenge, and so as he mentioned, if somebody, one person, bad guy, located inside the company, inside the organization, that is a big, big problem. So to reduce that risk, I think we have to be very broad measure, we have to implement very broad measure. But to answer your question, I think one of the way is simulation. Simulation means almost the same as practice, practice, practice. But utilizing the single simulation environment, some people may hold the name that is the cyber range. That is the defense sector people sometimes use. Cyber range is a cyber environment similar to the cyber space, and they can test the latest technology or new technology or all the configuration and intentionally attack that machine, and they can see what will happen. So those kind of simulation if they can implement or they can conduct before the big event, that may help.
In fact, we did quite a bit of that, several hundred hours of war game simulation, training, etc.
On and on and on, years, literally. I mean, there is a very detailed, as those of you involved in TOCOM and in the Pyeongchang will know, there's a very detailed program of test events that go on and lots of rehearsing. We overlaid even more rehearsing for us, specifically by really stress testing. I mentioned earlier that we took a very different, new approach, as was then, to how we dealt with the cyber issue. So obviously all the standard perimeter, IPS, IDS proxies, all those things are in place, miles for us, a lot of that in place. But then we overlaid a sensor network that could give us much better situational awareness to spot the weak signals that are generally weak, that we could then react to. And that in itself took, we were very concerned that would have a big impact on latency and flow inside our network traffic. So we had to look at how that performed. So we spent a lot of time testing and stress testing that to see that we could genuinely, we were talking, actually funny enough, in those days we were talking about a few 100,000 events per second. We now run similar service at millions of events per second that we're analysing with selectors and enrichment. So quite a big need to test there. But as I say, it's a very comprehensive testing package and rehearsing that comes in, as I'm sure Steve knows as well, that is pretty thorough, but with new threats and new stuff coming along. And the other thing I was just going to say, in response to your question, so back to what Steve was saying, the criminal piece. I remember sitting down with a bunch of people and sort of hot towels on head and saying, what's the worst possible thing that you can think of, and then starting to work backwards from there. And it's not intuitive. We like to be able to compartmentalize stuff. We like to try and build on a priori knowledge. The reality is, I think Steve made the point exceptionally well, you've got to get into completely unthinkable stuff. The reality is these big global events, the Olympic Games especially, you are in a world of a threat environment which is like no other.
Right. So if we could change the lighting so that we can see the audience, and we'll start taking questions from the audience. So one here. So we have a couple microphones. So introduce yourself.
Thank you for this inspirational talks. My name is Takeshi Kajan. I'm actually work for the Tokyo 2020 organization committee. So I wish I would be sitting here after 5 years of session. Anyway, as for the risk assessment, that is actually what I'm just facing now. But so things are getting more complicated than maybe 12 games. So what I'm trying to do is actually to identify or even to figure out how the whole risk architecture is in hosting the Olympic Games in Tokyo. And rather than focusing on each system or networks at this moment, I think I'd like to identify the whole rough figure of the whole architecture and possible risks. But the reality is I learned a lot from the ISO standards of crisis management or risk management and so on. But it looks like everything is very immature. And there is no complete set of methodology to provide a systematic methodology to identify all that comprehensive risks. So I'd like to ask any advice or idea how to start that kind of systematic activity, because we need to repeat that activity year on year, with the situation changing year on year. But looks like it may take more than 5 years to just complete one cycle at this moment. So I really want to ask any advice. And some people may say, okay, I can consult you, so how much do you have? So I think, okay, everything is maybe business, but at least looks like everything is immature. And so I'm not sure if it's worth to pay some consulting fee for this good consulting fee. I really need more standardized way of thinking to analyze.
Great, thank you. We can pass the mic to Dr. Ross.
Lynn Wells, I heard said the other day that the Tokyo Olympics is going to be the first Olympics where there are more censors than spectators. And you talked about the IoT and the number of events per second. As you factor in the explosion of interactions among the IoT, isn't there's a qualitatively different problem than just more and more traditional events to be dealt with? And if so, how do you handle it?
Jim, like Mr. Japan. Yeah, I'd like to raise the issue about the, when we are preparing for the 2018 and 2020, and what is exactly the target year? Because it's not end of the 2020, but the preparation for the cybersecurity structure in the city and the events and everything, and then you were talking about the coming all the tourism raising from many countries, and what exactly the target should be from a point of view of a targeted year, like a 2030 to be the target year for the preparation, because it's a kind of investing for the 2020. What that means, for the lasting for the another 5 years or 10 years, then carrying to the next Olympic cities. What the model should be.
To address those in the time remaining. Starting backwards on the target, Mark, you were saying that at this time before the London Olympics, 5 years before, there was already kind of an initial technical lockdown.
Yep, that's right. And so it is 6 years out to the first technical lockdown, certainly in our case, and then we iterated thereafter. It was particularly in my area that we carried on iterating for obvious reasons, but not exclusively because I mentioned Wi-Fi already. That was a late edition overlay, and all the rest of it. In your question, I think really interesting. It's one that excites me a lot about having had the honour of being involved in the 2012 Games. Is that the legacy thing from the International Olympic Committee, and I'm sure you know this as well, the bids are won as much on legacy as they are on staging the games, and that's been a huge thing in the UK and in London as well. And cyber's a big part of that. As I said earlier on, it kick-started certainly a lot to do with cyber in the UK. There's always a load more that we could be doing, a load more everyone could be doing, but certainly there was an awareness there that really focused on minds. So legacy is important in the cyber land as well. How far out that goes? I think we talked about 50, 60-year legacy in the 2012 Games. Most of the Olympics Park now, for those of you who know London, is now a residential space, and a lot of the venues have been changed to make it much more public friendly. A really exciting, fantastic development, which is a great legacy.
In general, is that do you think is the investment to be approved or approved, or to be a kind of a right destination?
It is absolutely part of the organising committee and the development authority, which is the bit that actually builds all the stuff. Their return on investment is obviously taken, the venues get disposed of afterwards. So in the UK's case, the Olympic Stadium, hosted to the Rugby World Cup, there's a well-known Premiership football club going in there, West Ham United, very soon. So that's been converted, and as I said, all the Olympic athletes, the villages have been turned into residential accommodation as well. So the object was to make money out of the games in the UK.
And similarly for the Sydney Olympics, you had a great legacy there. And I think Beijing shows the counterpoint of overdoing things and not having any plan for how it's going to last, including physical and cyber.
Yeah, and possibly was it the involvement of business, right? So a lot of organisations, companies, took their own Olympic programs in play as well, and they sort of looked at their own security or their own business disruption risks. And I remember a couple of years early, it must have been like 1998, I think, and I was just started in consulting, and we ran a major exercise in Sydney that had all the banks and insurance houses involved, trying to work out how do we best deal with people coming to work. And I think they probably did it more in the UK, but we started on, well, actually don't come to work from home. And I think because there was that momentum and engagement of business, it wasn't just run and stop. There was a good flow through afterwards, a lot of positive effect.
Absolutely. Now, for the other questions, I'm actually going to combine them a little bit because the acceleration of technological change and IoT coming into it certainly has an impact on how you do appropriate risk assessments and impact assessments, et cetera. And one of the things I'm going to rephrase it just a little bit is how close do you have to be to perfect before you start your iterative process, right? And how do you get that first step going and instead of taking 5 years to get that really locked down?
I would like to point out on the Internet of Things thing. At least at present, we have a situation that within Internet of Things, security comes second. It doesn't come first. You know, people who are designing devices that use Internet of Things, they use very dumb things, and there we have to work. There we have to work. And that goes back to what you have said, you have a technology lockdown. Attacks don't have a technology lockdown. They will get on and on. And that is the big challenge. So for the moment, Internet of Things would be a major problem if used in new and ad hoc environments.
I'd like to not that answer, but to give some advice for how can we prepare for the risk assessment and how can we build the reliable risk assessment framework. Okay, this is based on my experience working in Japanese organization, and one of the challenge for the Japanese organization is clear accountability. Even though people who got the director position or manager position, sometimes they cannot oversee the whole organization, the whole process of the team. So give the clear accountability for the manager or director to oversee the risk assessment. I think that is one of the key points. And also, sometimes Japanese organization gets, I think that is similar problem around the world, but the horizontal collaboration, or small groups usually tend to work for small objective, not the goal of the whole team, whole structure. Small team may work for a small objective that is given to one team, but that team needs to understand the goal of the whole structure, whole team, and work toward challenge the objective to the goal, and need to bring the best performance or best efficiency. That team needs to collaborate horizontally. So horizontal collaboration and horizontal review mechanism, if you can implement that, gives a very strong structure for this assessment, but maybe security protection or preparedness. That is what my team is implementing.
Stephen?
Taka-san, I think it's all about agility and speed, and I think your comment, right? We do a lockdown, the bad guys keep going. I do see it in Japanese businesses that there is a hierarchy that needs to be respected. I understand that. I see in Australian companies, I see in Chinese companies, in Singaporean businesses, sometimes similar. But for the task you have right now, and the runway you have, which is only really 5 years, when you look when the games are on, I think that agility is great advice. And then coming back to your question, why PwC? We'd love to. We've done, we've done 30 Olympics and G20s and so forth around the world, but if you don't buy PwC, do get someone, because none of us own all the knowledge on this, and that collaboration and that sharing and experience is priceless. And if you can tap into someone, you tap into the history that's been built through all the Olympic Games, if you tap into us or someone, whoever, it's going to accelerate thinking and identification of some of those issues.
So the other aspect that I think goes into that is where do policies and standardization processes come into effect for how you do that risk assessment? For instance, you mentioned that current IoT devices mostly are insecure by design. They're meant to get to market fast as opposed to having any security around them. But Japan specifically is actually funding projects for IoT, especially flat IoT, industrialized IoT, secure by design architectures and fundamentals. So it could be that some of the risk assessment gets to the point that you say, we won't buy anything unless it's up to these standards or these policy basics that we want to have. And if we can't do it with that, if the smart wear stuff from Adidas or Nike doesn't play up to that level, then they're not going to be allowed to communicate, right? They can monitor it and then plug it in later and take the data off of it.
Because you addressed that. IoT is using the same internet as other devices are using. So there's no reason that they use different standards for security. The reason why IoT was so poor in terms of security is because of the, let's say, 8051. Because we had processes that had very limited capabilities. This is history. You can build into small devices high capabilities in terms of communication, in terms of processing, in terms of encryption, in terms of identity, all things which are genuine to security. Therefore, I think we have to go away that you use the same, in the direction that you use the same standards for security in IoT as you use in other areas. Otherwise, you will always keep this two walls.
So I think we have time for one more short question if somebody has something burning. But
quick question. Can you hear me? I think we touched on it, but specifically, is there a need to have some type of task force or other means for getting police from other countries into Japan or virtually connected to Japan to support criminal investigations that might arise through cyber incidents during the Olympics?
Look, you could create a task force, you could rely on Interpol. Interpol, well established in the region, the cyber fusion centres in Singapore. The guy, I think, Nabaru is here from Japan. You could utilise that mechanism, or you could create a more localised regional one. And thinking as I'm answering here, a localised regional one could be good. I hadn't heard about bringing the other police forces in to a game, which is a great idea. But I don't think we want New Zealand policemen coming to rugby games in Australia. But maybe it is a case of Japan, Korea, China, a few others, and doing something locally, because again it comes back to knowing who you're working with. So when something does go wrong, if it's a phone, if it's face to face, you know this person, you trust them, you've got some collaboration with them, and it's just going to be dealt with more effectively.
great. So we'll close this out now. I'd say that a couple of major topics that really came up over and over again was the governance factor, right? The practice factor. And then bringing in the knowledge from other areas, whether that's other people who run Olympics or risk assessments, bringing in the knowledge that you have local, right? Because this is not only with Mark mentioned reputational damage. This is reputational damage not just to the sponsoring companies, but to the country as a whole. And this is something that you really have to get right. So saving a few dollars here or there is not great.
Phil Barton, I'll just say one thing, because it's a bit doom and gloom in this room today. All those disasters, that scenarios that we're talking about. Having lived through it, I sincerely hope that you're here in 2021 to do sort of something similar to that. It was the most fantastic experience you could imagine. The buzz and the national lift and boost it gave the UK was astonishing. And I'm sure it'll be the same for Japan. So all I can say is you're really best of luck, and for the Rugby World Cup in 2019, let's not forget, and for Oxford career as well.
I can endorse that. Sydney is a wonderful city, it's beautiful, but it was at its best in the games. It was like no other time. And in fact, the day after the closing ceremony, I went with my wife to Paris for a meeting, and we came back, and it was actually sad. 6 days later, Sydney was sad because we've been on such a magnificent high, and it was like the party was over. But it's a great experience.
Thank you, everyone.